Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts.
As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. The question before us this evening is, what is the best account of the objectivity of moral values and duties? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Second, atheism does not provide as sound a foundation as theism for the objectivity of moral values and duties. So let's look at that first contention together. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. He is not merely perfectly good, he is the paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving character supplies the absolute standard against which all things are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, moral values are objective, being wholly independent of human beings. Second, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's will or commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, and self-sacrifice, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, and oppression. In summary, then, theism grounds the objectivity of both moral values and moral duties. Hence, it's evident that if God does exist, we have a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Let's turn then to my second contention, that atheism does not provide as sound a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. I'm not going to argue this point in general. Rather, I want to look specifically at Dr. Wielenberg's view, which he calls godless normative realism, and ask whether it provides as sound a foundation for morality as theism. I'm going to argue that godless normative realism not only involves extravagant metaphysical commitments, which make it very implausible, but it also faces a number of formidable objections as an account of objective moral values and duties. First, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims which make it very implausible. Because Dr. Wielenberg wants to affirm the objectivity and even necessity of moral values and duties, he cannot take them to be mere byproducts of biological evolution or social conditioning. Rather, he must find some transcendent ground for the objectivity of moral values and duties. He finds this in moral Platonism. His view is akin to mathematical Platonism, which holds that in addition to the world of concrete objects, there exists a transcendent realm of immaterial, causally effete, abstract objects like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities. Most of us think that such entities have at most a sort of conceptual reality. But for the Platonist, these objects are objectively real. Wielenberg holds that moral values are similarly abstract objects of some sort, existing independently of human beings. When the right physical situations occur in the world, these abstract objects supervene on the situations. So, for example, the abstract object, goodness, supervenes on two people's loving each other, so that their loving each other is objectively good. Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves hefty metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison. The prominent metaphysician Peter van Inwagen explains, the Platonist must think of objects of what there is as falling into two exclusive and exhaustive categories, the abstract and the concrete. If X falls into one of these categories and Y into the other, then no two things could be more different than X and Y. The differences between God and this pen pale into insignificance when they are compared with the differences between this pen and the number 4. Indeed, the number seems no more like the pen than like God. The difference between any abstract object and any concrete object would seem to be the maximum difference any two objects could display. Given this strange bifurcation of reality into these two causally unconnected domains, it would be much more credible to suppose that one of the categories is empty. But concrete objects are indisputably real and well understood, in contrast to abstract objects. So, Van Inwagen maintains, the presumption should be that abstract objects do not exist. Nominalism of some sort is thus the default position. Indeed, Van Inwagen believes one should not believe in abstract objects unless one feels rationally compelled by some weighty consideration or argument. A philosopher should wish not to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist. The objectivity of moral values cannot itself provide such a rationally compelling reason, since Dr. Wielenberg acknowledges that he has no rationally compelling arguments either for the objectivity of moral values or for moral Platonism. He thus cannot overcome the presumption against Platonism and hence against godless normative realism. The theist, by contrast, faces no such obstacle because he grounds moral values in a concrete object, namely God, and so is not committed to a realm of abstract.
Craig claims that God provides the only solid foundation for objective moral values and duties. But this idea collapses under scrutiny. First, grounding morality in God's character creates what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If morality depends on God's will, then it's arbitrary. God could declare cruelty or genocide good, and we'd be forced to accept it. If God commands things because they're already good, then morality exists independently of God, which defeats Craig's entire point. Second, Craig criticizes Wielenberg's view for being metaphysically extravagant, but belief in a timeless, immaterial, all-powerful being who created the universe is hardly modest. In fact, philosophers like Graham Oppy and J.L. Mackie argue that postulating moral facts is actually less speculative than inventing an invisible deity to explain them. And third, we don't need a God to explain why abuse or oppression is wrong. Evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and social cooperation offer strong, natural explanations for why humans develop shared moral norms. Studies from Franz de Waal and Michael Tomasello show empathy, fairness, and even altruism in non-human primates. Morality doesn't need religion to exist. It needs minds capable of valuing others.
Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts. You may have noticed that Craig didn't dispute these implications of his view. Indeed, he didn't mention them at all. His only reply here is that, quote, "The ultimate source of our moral obligations is far beyond our experience," end quote. So I say that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that it might seem that way, but really it takes an order from God to render that nap immoral. Second, Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong acts inexplicable, because by commanding us to do what he knows we won't do anyway, God would only create more evil. In my last speech, I pointed out a simple defect in Craig's attempt to answer this challenge. Craig didn't address this defect in his last speech, so I'll just remind you of it. Suppose I perform some evil act, like heartlessly ignoring the suffering child. Craig says that because I deserve to be punished for my evil act, God must forbid the act so that he can then punish me. The problem, again, is that if the act deserves punishment because it is evil, then God is justified in punishing me for the evil act without first forbidding the act. As I said in my last speech, if I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world creates a contradiction within Craig's view. Psychological research shows that whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right and wrong, they are incapable of grasping the authority of morality. Remember that in trying to explain how God could impose obligations on people who don't believe in him, Craig proposed that by giving non-believers an intuitive grasp of morality's demands and authority, God is able to get his commands through and impose moral obligations on non-believers. However, because psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority, God hasn't imposed any moral obligations on them, which means that, on Craig's view, they have no moral obligations. In a striking turn of events, Dr. Craig, despite having railed for years against atheism's inability to account for the moral wrongness of the acts of psychopaths, and having declared tonight that Christianity teaches that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, now entertains the possibility that psychopaths do not know the difference between right and wrong and are not culpable for their evil acts. But remember that in his flawed attempt to explain wrong action, Craig said that it was unacceptable for evildoers to get away with evil, and that God would never permit such a thing. Here are Craig's own words, quote, "By issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable," end quote. So Craig must hold that psychopaths are culpable for their evil acts, and so do have moral obligations. For otherwise, some psychopaths would, as he puts it, literally get away with murder. We can now see that Craig has painted himself into a corner in tonight's debate. Since psychopaths are incapable of recognizing morality's authority, Craig must deny that they have moral obligations. Yet he must also hold that God doesn't let them get away with their evil acts, and so they do have moral obligations. I hope you will listen carefully to Dr. Craig's closing remarks and pay careful attention to what, if anything, he says about the three challenges I've just explained. The first two challenges show that Craig's view has deeply implausible implications, including that there are no wrong actions and that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. The third challenge is even more serious because it reveals a contradiction in Craig's position. Craig's position leads to the impossible view that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Please listen carefully to what, if anything, Dr. Craig has to say about these three challenges in his closing remarks.
Wielenberg exposes a dangerous flaw in Craig's view. If morality depends entirely on God's command, then without God, even something like stopping 1 million Holocausts wouldn't actually be morally required. That's not just absurd, it's deeply unsettling. We don't need a divine order to know that letting millions suffer when we could help is wrong. Our moral intuitions, combined with reason and empathy, are more than enough, and that's supported by evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. Studies from institutions like Oxford and Harvard have shown that human brains are wired with empathy, fairness, and harm avoidance, even in infants, long before they're taught religion. Wielenberg also highlights the contradiction in Craig's logic with psychopaths. Psychologists like Dr. Kent Keel have proven that many psychopaths can't experience moral emotions like guilt or understand moral responsibility the way others do. If Craig is right, they're not morally obligated. But if they aren't, then according to Craig's own words, they get away with murder. That completely undermines the idea that God's commands are a consistent moral framework. In reality, Wielenberg's godless moral realism fits better with what we observe in the real world. Our moral sense doesn't require a supernatural source to exist or to matter.
Does your view address cases where moral duties conflict? For example, the classic case of lying to protect Jews from Nazi soldiers that appear at your door.
Yeah, so the way, the view I hold, the sort of where what is morally required of us depends on what moral reasons we have, is similar to the view put forward by the early 20th century philosopher W.D. Ross. So the basic idea is morality is kind of messy. There are all these different things that provide moral reasons for us to do certain things or not do certain things. And it's when you're trying to figure out what to do, a lot of times it's just a matter of weighing these reasons against each other. And so I would think in that case, I mean, that's just a particularly difficult case in the sense that you've got sort of weighty moral reasons on both sides, and it may be very difficult to know what the right thing to do is. So there are a lot of easy cases, like if you promise to meet someone for lunch, and here's a classic example from philosophy land, filled with drowning babies. So you promise to meet someone for lunch, you're passing through philosophy land, here's a drowning baby. If you save the baby, you'll break the promise. There it seems clear that the reason to the importance of saving the baby outweighs the promise. But there are other cases that are harder. I think if the question is about conflicting duties, I would think of those cases as cases where you just have weighty reasons on both sides, and it's hard to tell what your duty is, but there wouldn't literally be conflicting duties. There would be one actual obligation. It can just be very hard to know what it is when you've got weighty reasons sort of pulling in conflicting directions.
It seems to me that this highlights the problem of trying to derive moral obligations from simply normative considerations of weighing the moral values of alternative actions. Indeed, it makes me wonder what the situation with psychopaths would be on this sort of view, since they wouldn't be capable, in many cases I should think, of weighing the moral norms required to have an obligation. Certainly mentally retarded people and infants and people in comatose conditions would not be able to derive moral obligations in that way. Whereas I would say on my view, I was talking about normal moral agents, not mentally ill people, comatose people, little infants, mentally retarded. That's what I meant when I was referring to being written on the hearts of all people, was normal moral agents.
Okay, Dr. Craig, the next question is for you. The questioner asks, why should we obey God's commands? Where does that should come from? How is that should grounded in God?
Right. This relates to the question that came up a little bit in the debate about whether or not your moral theory has some sort of explanatory ultimate which cannot be further explained. And it seems to me the divine command theorist could say simply that this is my theory, that divine commands constitute our moral obligations, and therefore the question arises, doesn't even arise, well, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory that you're giving, and this is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation. Seems to me that would be perfectly legitimate move. But he could say something else. He could say that we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. And that would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. And if God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. And so in this case, you're not left with some sort of brute explanatory ultimate. Rather, you would have an explanation for why you should obey God's commands, because God has commanded you to obey all his commands, including that one. So it seems to me that that would be a perfectly acceptable answer to the question that was raised by the questioner.
Okay, so I think this question is helpful. It brings out another sort of important parallel between, I think, mine and Craig's view, and actually, as far as I can tell, anybody who wants to believe in objective moral truths or facts, which is, at some point, you're going to need a moral axiom, where you have some basic moral claim or principle which has no further explanation outside of itself. And so I think sometimes in debates between theists and atheists about morality, it's presented this way: well, on the theist view, God is the foundation, then on the atheist view, they sort of have no foundation. That's very misleading. I think both views require moral axioms. The only difference is which moral axioms. On the particular question of why obey God's commands, I would just point out that the sort of most prominent defenders of divine command theory, for example, Robert Adams, they realize that this is a very pressing question. Robert Adams spends a lot of time trying to provide reasons to obey God's commands, and in doing so, he inevitably, predictably appeals to unexplained, brute moral axioms. So I think you can't get away from it.
Wielenberg is absolutely right. Every moral system has to start somewhere. But the moment Craig says, obey God because God said so, he's admitting that his foundation is just as unexplained. Worse, it's circular. He defines morality by God's will, then defines God's will as moral. That's not moral reasoning, that's obedience. Now compare that to Wielenberg's view. He says some moral truths, like suffering without justification is wrong, are self-evident, not because we feel them, but because they're rationally compelling. This idea has deep roots in moral philosophy. Thinkers like G.E. Moore and Christine Korsgaard argue that some values don't need grounding in a deity. They're built into the structure of reason itself. And science backs this up. Research from developmental psychologists like Paul Bloom shows that even babies, as young as 6 months, can recognize helpful versus harmful behavior. They prefer kind puppets over mean ones, long before they can be taught religion. That's hard evidence that moral understanding can emerge naturally. So when Wielenberg says we don't need God to explain moral truth, he's not dodging the question. He's offering a view that actually fits what we see in the real world, where morality isn't handed down from above, but built from empathy, logic, and human connection. So here's what we want to know. Do you think morality should come from authority or from reason and empathy? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this made you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more philosophy, facts, and debates that actually matter.